I came home last night and I almost murdered my husband. Okay, this one's kind of funny. Today I'm hosting the first sourdough Q&A session for the Grant Bakes YouTube channel. I'm going to be answering 5 sourdough related questions that were sent in by viewers via email. If you like to bake sourdough bread at home without all of the unnecessary steps and complicated terminology, I really think these questions and answers are going to be helpful for you. We're diving into the weeds a little bit on a few questions, but my goal overall is to show you that sourdough doesn't have to be complicated. It's really fun and easy to make at home, and anyone can make it. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, let me know in the comments, and let's dive into the first question. Christina says this: "Hello Grant, I came home last night and I almost murdered my husband." Okay, this one's kind of funny. "I fed my starter from the refrigerator yesterday when I got off of work. I like to leave my starter on the stovetop with the light on. This works wonders for my starter. It's always ready to go in about 3 to 4 hours. Anywho, he," Christina's husband, "he bakes a friggin' pizza and my starter was half cooked. OMG. This is my first and original starter that I made back in February. I wanted to kill him. I was so upset." Christina, we all feel you. I have actually put my sourdough bread, not my starter, but I put my bread dough on the top of the stove to rest while the oven was preheating one time. I came back to find that about half of my loaf that was closest to the oven was cooked and the other half was still dough. I put it too close to the oven and the oven heat was rising and cooking the loaf without it being in the oven at all. So if you do put your dough or your sourdough starter on top of the stove, just know that you're running a risk of someone turning on the oven, turning on the stove without noticing your starter, without noticing your dough, and cooking it and ruining your sourdough for you. Christina, your question is this: once you make a new sourdough starter using my method with rye flour, when can you start feeding it regular white bread flour? Or do you have to keep feeding it rye flour? What do I recommend? What I always tell everyone to do is create your sourdough starter from scratch using whole grain rye flour. It's the flour that works best for me. It's got a lot of organisms and beneficial bacteria or whatever that's on the flour. It just works really well at creating a starter fast. That's my experience. Once you have an established starter, the starter is doubling in size after you feed it and it's falling back down again, then you can start transitioning your starter to feeding it whatever you want. At that point, I just keep 25 grams of that starter in my fridge and then I pull it out the night before I want to bake bread. I'll feed it whatever flour I'm gonna use for the next day's recipe. That's usually white bread flour. So I establish my starter with whole grain rye flour, and then once it's mature, I use whatever flour I want to use to feed it, whether that's white bread flour, whole grain spelt flour, or whole grain rye flour. Whatever I'm using for the recipe is what I will feed my starter. There are plenty of sourdough starter maintenance routines. I have a video where I share what I use for mine. You can do this method if you want to. You can keep your starter 100% whole grain rye flour if you want to, that's fine too. But I find it to be the easiest method for me is I just create the starter with rye flour and then I switch to using whatever flour I want to from that day forward. That's what works for me. I know it'll work for you too. This question is from Dottie. She says, "What is your method for storing a loaf of sourdough bread once you have cut into it?" There are plenty of ways to store sourdough bread. There are linens you can wrap your bread in. Some people like to wrap their bread in plastic, but what I like to do is fairly simple. I just slice into the loaf of sourdough bread, place the loaf of sourdough bread on a wooden cutting board or a plastic cutting board with the cut side down. So the loaf is literally just sitting there with the cut side facing down and the dome part of the sourdough bread facing up. It's just sitting out there exposed to the air, and I usually try to eat it within 1 or 2 days and it stays pretty fresh. If you leave the cut side facing up or facing off to the side, the air will dry it out and a lot of moisture will leave the loaf. So if you put the cut side down, that really doesn't happen as quickly, so it gives me a day or two to finish eating that loaf of bread while it stays fairly nice. I am living in Arizona now, so I find that the drier climate might be drying out my bread a little faster than what I was used to back in the Midwest. So if you live in a dry climate, you might just get 1 day out of your sourdough bread if you store it this way. But if you live other places where it's a little bit more humid, you might get a few days out of it. But that's my simple solution for storing sourdough. I just try to eat it within 1 or 2 days. I eat about half of it on the first day, store the bread with the cut side facing down on a cutting board, and I eat the rest of the bread usually the next day. It gives me 1 or 2 days of sourdough bread, and the crust stays pretty nice and the loaf doesn't really dry out. If I try to store bread in a plastic bag, which I've seen people do, and I've even done plenty of times myself, but if I put it in plastic, it just totally softens out the entire loaf. The crust loses all of its crustiness, so I try to avoid storing my bread in plastic if at all possible. Marilyn asks, how would you gift a loaf of sourdough bread if you had to bake it in advance? Would you give the bread frozen, or would you bake it the night before, put it in a Ziploc bag, and give it to the person the next day? No, I don't like to give bread frozen. I like to give it fresh, and because I want it to be fresh, I think it's best to give bread that's as fresh as possible. So what I like to do is wake up maybe a little bit earlier the day that I'm gonna give someone a loaf of bread and bake the bread in the morning, and then I give it to them fresh, because the fresher the bread, the better it's gonna be for them to experience. So I like to avoid giving stale or old bread if at all possible, so I like to bake the bread in the morning and give it to them that same day. It might mean waking up an hour earlier than I'm normally going to, but I find that the trade-off is just worth it. And logistically, I like to avoid putting it in a plastic bag or a Ziploc bag. If I have to put it in something, I like to put the bread in a brown paper bag or some kind of linen, which I don't usually have, so I usually end up going with a brown paper bag and bringing the bread to them that way. It doesn't look the best. I'm still looking for maybe a really good solution for some type of linen or bread bag that I can use as a gifting option. I haven't found the best solution there. So for me right now, a brown paper bag is the best thing I've found to transport the bread. But if anyone has any kind of solution that they like better than a brown paper bag that's not plastic, go ahead and leave that in the comments and share your thoughts with all of us. LaDonna asks a question about sourdough pizza. She says, hello, I'm trying out different sourdough pizza recipes. Haven't found the perfect one for me yet. I see that some call for honey, quick rising yeast, and or olive oil. Also, do I need to use pizza flour? What do you recommend? There are a bunch of different sourdough pizza recipes out there. One thing is for sure, and that's that you don't have to use any yeast when you're making sourdough pizza. You can, it would be a mixture of sourdough and yeast, but you don't have to. There are sourdough pizza recipes out there that just use sourdough starter and nothing else to make the dough rise. Just like when you get into sourdough bread baking, you might find yourself going down a bunch of different rabbit holes with hydration percentages, ratios, and this flour or that flour. Getting into pizza is very similar, and it might even be worse. There are so many people that say you have to do this when making pizza, or you have to use this type of flour, or it has to be this or that. There's so many rabbit holes you can go down with pizza, and I love it because I love to make pizza and bread, but it can be really confusing to new pizza makers. So just know that you can keep things simple. I have a great sourdough pizza recipe that I think people really like. It uses a sheet pan and you just bake it in your home oven. It's a very simple sourdough pizza recipe that only uses flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter. So it's really simple, really straightforward. I think it's a great pizza recipe that's really approachable for almost anyone who knows how to make sourdough bread. So go ahead and check out my sourdough pizza recipe. I'll include a link to it in the video description below. And then from there, it might springboard you into going into more complicated pizza recipes, getting your own pizza oven at home, whatever you want to do, but at least start with something simple like this recipe that I'm recommending below. This question is from Suzanne. Hello, thank you for making a video for those that are new to sourdough baking. You're welcome, Suzanne. That's what I love to do. She says, I spend half of my time in Florida, so I would like to know if you can freeze sourdough starter and discard, and how to use them if possible. So her question is, can you freeze sourdough starter with the purpose of using it later? Of course you can. I actually would recommend, if you want to freeze your sourdough starter, take about 25 grams of sourdough starter in your jar. That's usually what I keep around in the fridge anyway. And then feed those 25 grams of starter 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. Just a regular feeding for me. Just leave it on the counter at room temperature, wait till it rises to double in size, and then watch it fall back down again. So you might have to wait a full 24 hours or longer until it falls back down again. The starter will have lost all of its rising power, so it won't be rising again unless you feed it. So you've basically got sourdough discard. Take a tablespoon or just a spoonful, about 25 grams of that discard, that starter, and put it into a Ziploc bag or some kind of plastic bag that you can completely seal, and then get all of the air out of that bag that you can, zip it up, seal it, and then put that bag in the freezer. The starter will freeze, and because it's discard, it's lost all of that rising power, you won't have any kind of danger of it rising in the bag or expanding and breaking the bag. So it's just purely discard that you've put into the freezer. You'll be able to revive it later and create a healthy bubbling starter once again. Leave it in the freezer for a month, 2 months, 3 months, really as long as you want to. I don't know what the limit on that is, but you could probably leave it in there for up to a year and revive it. To revive the starter, take it out of the freezer, let it thaw at room temperature until the starter is liquidy again, and then put that liquid starter into a clean jar, feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. It should take about 12 to 24 hours to double in size and rise once again. Then you can use it in your bread, or you can discard it and feed it more, whatever your process is. I like to use my no discard method, so I would just use it in my bread directly and it's ready to go. But Suzanne, you say you live in Florida, you're there about half of the time. I don't know if that means you're there on weekends or if you spend months in Florida. Just take some of your starter along with you. I like to travel with my starter. People make it seem more complicated than it actually is, but if you want to, you can take your starter with you to your destination and just keep it going there. I'd kind of follow the same process. I would feed my starter at home, wait till it rises and then falls back down again, so you know it's not gonna expand anymore. Then take a spoonful of that starter, put it in a small plastic bag, zip it up. You can even put it into a plastic jar at that point with a lid because you don't want it to fall out or spill out into your luggage or anything like that. But at that point, you've got about 25 grams of sourdough starter or discard with you in a plastic jar that you can take with you on a plane or on a road trip to your destination, especially if you're going to live in this location or stay there for a long period of time. Why not take a little starter with you, feed it once you get there, and then maintain it in the fridge as you normally would. Starter can travel really well if you travel with a small amount of it. If you start traveling with a huge cup of starter or anything over, 3 ounces or whatever the limit is for TSA, then you're gonna get questions about what you're trying to travel with. Just travel with a small amount of starter and it can happily make it to your destination, and you could use it while you're on vacation or while you're living in a different state. Travel with your starter if you want to, that is. If not, you can freeze it. You can just keep it in the fridge if it's gonna be a short trip, whatever you want to do. If I'm only going to be gone for a week or two, I'll just keep mine in the fridge. If you're going to be gone a lot longer, I would say either freeze some of your starter as a backup or travel with it so you know you've got your starter that you can maintain while you're gone. I have one more bonus question that I'm actually going to answer from somebody. I think this will help a lot of people that are curious about my sourdough starter maintenance and feeding routine. But first, I want to let you know that this video is actually sponsored by Cooey Housewares. They're a home goods and kitchen products company based out of Muskegon, Michigan, and they're actually offering a 10% discount on all of their kitchen products to Grant Bakes viewers. You just have to use the code GrantBakes10 when you go to their website, CooeyHousewares.com. I've actually been using this digital scale lately from Cooey Housewares. It's kind of an upgraded scale to the one I usually use, which is a very cheap model that I got off of Amazon. My cheap scale is fine and it gets the job done and I've always used it, but it's kind of nice to have a more high quality digital scale. And to be honest, it's still very affordable. It's about 30 bucks or so. So if you want to get a nice digital scale or any other kitchen products, first try CooeyHousewares.com, see if they have what you're looking for, because you can even get 10% off using my discount code GrantBakes10 at checkout. Thanks Cooey Housewares for sponsoring today's video, and here's the bonus question. What's the difference in all of the feeding ratios for sourdough starter? I understand a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding, but what does it mean if I do a 1-2-2 feeding or a 1-5-5 feeding? Does this speed up or slow down the starter? I don't actually talk about sourdough starter feeding ratios very much on my channel. You might see that out there in the sourdough universe. It's just a way we talk about how we feed our starter and in what ratios. So a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding is the easiest to understand. It just means we use equal amounts by weight of starter, water, and flour. The last two numbers might actually be mixed up. It might be flour and water or water and flour. I'm not really sure because I usually keep those the same. The way I'm gonna explain it is the first number is sourdough starter, the second number is water, and the third number is flour. So for a 1-1-1 feeding, an example would be 50 grams of sourdough starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour. You mix that together and you let your starter rise. You just did a 1-1-1 feeding. What I actually do for my sourdough starter feeding routine is a 1-2-2 feeding. I usually keep 25 grams of sourdough starter in my fridge left over from the last time I baked. And then the night before I want to bake bread again, I take that 25 grams of starter out of the fridge and I feed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. That would technically be a 1-2-2 feeding. 25 grams of starter, double that amount is 50 grams of water, and then 50 grams of flour. 1 part to 2 parts to 2 parts, a 1-2-2 feeding. You could also do a 1-4-4 feeding, where you double the water and flour again, or a 1-5-5 feeding. No matter what you do, your starter, water, and flour can make up some kind of a ratio like this. So does the ratio of your sourdough starter feeding speed up or slow down your starter? It actually does. Generally speaking, the more starter you use in your feeding, the faster your starter is going to rise. So a 1-1-1 feeding with total equal amounts of starter, water, and flour, that's gonna rise faster than a 1-2-2 feeding. It might not be twice as fast, but in general, it's gonna rise faster than a 1-2-2 feeding because it's gonna take extra time for the yeasts in that starter to multiply and just do their magic and make the starter rise. I like to keep things simple. I always just keep 25 grams of starter in my fridge. I feed it 50 grams of flour and water. It's technically a 1-2-2 feeding, but I don't really even think about that too much. I just know that by the next morning, the starter will have risen to double in size. And if it's not quite there yet, I'll give it an extra hour or two and I'll wait till it's doubled in size and then I'll use it in my bread dough. So if you use less starter in your ratio, your sourdough starter is gonna rise slower. And if you have more starter in that ratio, your starter is going to rise faster. One way you could use this strategically in your routine throughout the year, especially if you live in an area where it's colder during the winter and relatively warmer during the summer, is you could change up the ratios that you use in the winter and in the summer. In the winter, when it's colder in your home and the kitchen gets a little bit cooler, you know that your starter is gonna move a little bit slower. It's gonna be more sluggish during the winter. So just add more starter to your jar that you normally keep in the fridge, and then you'll have a higher ratio to use when you feed your starter. Keep 50 grams of starter in the fridge during the winter and do a 1-1-1 feeding. Feed 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour. Your starter should, in theory, rise a little bit faster. And then in the summer, just go back to keeping 25 grams of starter in your fridge at all times, and you'll do a 1-2-2 feeding. So 25 grams starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water. Your kitchen will be a little bit warmer, so it'll move your starter along faster and you don't need to keep as much starter in the jar. This is all kind of confusing if you're not used to talking about these ratios when talking about your sourdough starter, but basically, if you have more starter in the jar when you feed it, things will move more quickly. If you have less starter in the jar when you feed it, things will move a little bit slower. So you can change up that level and that amount of starter you're using to make things go faster or slower depending on what you want. I generally don't like to get into the weeds on ratios and things like that because I don't talk about them very often, but I follow a 1-2-2 feeding all the time for my normal sourdough starter maintenance routine. If you're interested in knowing more about the maintenance routine that I follow, I have another video that I dedicated specifically to outlining what I do on a weekly basis. You can check that video out here, and if you want to join my email list to participate in the next sourdough Q&A, go ahead and go to grantbakes.com/email and sign up. I'll let you know when we're doing the next one. I'll see you in the next video.